Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today, my guest is Zach Saffa. He is a music educator, a pianist, and the founder of the Studio Showcase series. Welcome to the show, Zach.
Hey, JT. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So maybe we could start off. You can tell us a little bit about what Studio Showcase series is and how you got involved in music and playing piano.
Yeah, I've had a bit of a circuitous journey back to the piano. I picked it up when I was 8, little kid in Queens, New York, and kind of had interest in and above average aptitude for it at that point. And it wasn't until I was 16, I think, where I actually found a teacher I connected with. And up until that point, it had been an on and off again relationship. I stopped playing. I started playing again. I took it seriously. I didn't take it seriously. I was good at it. I felt like I wasn't good at it. And then I've had a couple influential piano teachers since then. And there's nothing to that good education works other than a personal experience with it. And so I think that's what happened to me. And once I found, somebody I really connected with and helped me, learn music for myself and make connections that were relevant to me personally, then I think I began to engage with it in like a healthy way that I was able to encourage myself and like look for things I was good at and not try to fit into the mold of whatever I was supposed to be as an 8 or 16 or 22-year-old pianist,
Right. Yeah. How long would you work with a particular teacher? Do you have like kind of years spans that go through? I imagine the ability for that connection and be able to motivate over time through I would assume the ups and downs of that process learning. What was that experience like?
I mean, I think ideally you have someone you stick with for a while and they grow with you and you grow with them. And I think part of being a good educator is being able to evolve yourself over the course of a relationship with a student. But, for me, that teacher I was talking about, umpteenth teacher at age 16, is still someone I'm in contact with, and I've done performances with her, and she sends students to Studio Showcase, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, a little bit more. You asked me about it, and I haven't addressed it yet. But yeah, I really, really cherish that relationship. And my piano teacher from undergrad, I also still have a fantastic relationship with. He's come to concerts of mine. I've seen him play. We've met up in Italy before. My teacher from grad school was equally influential, although I was a bit of a more intense environment getting a master's in piano performance after some years off. And, we don't really have a personal relationship anymore, but it was definitely educational.
Yeah. Could you maybe talk about the more academic side? I imagine getting a master's in piano is maybe more theory driven and maybe history, like stuff that can be contained in a textbook. Whereas I would imagine also piano, you could take a course where you're just teaching yourself by the sound and feel. Like, could you kind of describe that educational difference there?
Yeah. I actually don't have an undergrad degree in music performance. I only have the master's degree. My undergrad degree was in mathematical economics from our alma mater, Wake Forest. And I was a music minor there and I studied piano and I was playing and everything, but I decided to get a real degree to go into the real world. I didn't go back for my master's in music until after I had graduated. I worked for a couple of years and then I decided I did want to have a go of it professionally in music. And so I took a student assistantship in Venice, Italy for a year, and then I came back to the States to start my master's. And when I applied for the master's programs, because I didn't have the undergrad degree in music in piano performance, and that's what I was applying for my master's, I was actually slightly limited in the schools I could apply to top tier schools, most of which I had no chance of getting into. I mean, if you apply to Juilliard for a master's, for instance, they don't care whether you have an undergrad degree in what you're applying for. They care about, are you good? Can you handle the coursework? And, what are your accomplishments as a performer or whatever you're applying for? And so, I sent in master's applications to Juilliard and Manhattan School of Music and all that stuff. And, I didn't get any auditions at those two places, but I did get 2, and I ended up getting into North Carolina School of the Arts. And that's where I did my master's in piano performance. And that's a great program. And I was really lucky to get in there. And it turned out really well for me because it gave me the fellowship that moved me back to New York.
Right. There's a couple of different things I wanted to kind of pick up on there. Maybe I'll start with the kind of being limited to the top tier. Is there a particular reason why maybe some of the best schools wouldn't necessarily have as many prerequisites? Is it just to open their pool of talent to maybe folks that would not have been noticed or recognized otherwise, and because they're so good, they have the ability
Yeah.
to attract them.
Yeah, I think the arts in particular, there's nothing necessarily about an undergraduate degree in a performing art that makes you more qualified than someone who doesn't have it. Right? I
Mm.
could see how if you were an accountant applying for a master's in accountancy, like they'd want to see that you did undergraduate coursework in that subject. For something like music, you originally asked me, is it more theory and history and things like that? I don't think it's proportionally more in master's than it is in undergrad, maybe slightly more advanced. Even I actually placed out of all the music and theory in graduate school, so I was able to just focus on the performance, which is rare.
Mm.
I really needed to grow. And yeah, I don't think I do think there are a lot of parallels between studying a more academic discipline and studying a performing art. One thing they do have differently is that rigor of like an undergraduate degree and a bachelor's. I don't think there's much carryover there. So yeah, so Juilliard, I think, trusts their own ability to audition and assess where one of their graduate students is at, much more than, a diploma from an unrelated undergraduate institution.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Are they looking maybe for more like pure talent that they can then cultivate? Do you think is that kind of part of it too?
Traditionally, yes, but also in graduate programs, you're usually making a relationship with a single teacher, a single professor. And as you get higher up, it's more specific and more personal. So when you apply to a doctoral degree, you really need to know who you're studying with and
Right.
exactly what you're going to be doing. In undergrad, most undergrads apply saying they don't know what their major is going to be. That would never fly in a master's or graduate program. And yeah, so when I applied to School of the Arts as for the master's degree, there was one specific teacher who heard my audition, saw me audition in person, and said, "I think I can work with him, and I want that kid in my studio."
Right.
So
It
so
sounds
it's
almost more
it's
like
yeah
a apprenticeship than a
yeah yeah
program.
that's yeah, in a lot of ways that's true. Yeah, and I would never think of an undergrad as an apprenticeship. Yeah.
Very cool. Another part I wanted to just unpack quickly, because I know for myself it's been maybe a mental debate as far as like getting a quote unquote real degree to get a quote unquote real job. I think that a lot of universities kind of tailor their programs to filter into particular industries or roles in corporations and things like that. Was that a maybe personal struggle that you had, whether to pursue your music passions or do kind of more associated with your mathematical economics background to go maybe into more of like a corporate or financial route? Could you talk us through kind of that decision making
Yeah.
process?
Yeah, it was every time it was a personal struggle. And I think only in the last few years, as Studio Showcase has crystallized, do I really have a little bit more confidence in the choices I've made to follow kind of a more traditional corporate path and more stable career versus going into something creative, something I love, something I know I'm really good at, and something I know that actually benefits the people I want to help. And so
Right.
I think until this project has really unfolded and started to show signs of being something sustainable and meaningful, yeah, I struggled a lot with those choices. And, they're still a part of my past. And I still think very much about what would have happened if I hadn't left that job in 2012 and if I'd have millions of dollars that I could now just funnel into Studio Showcase rather than, trying to raise revenue and fundraise and create a business model from scratch. But I also acknowledge that had I done that, Studio Showcase wouldn't exist. And,
Mm.
I wouldn't be where I am. I certainly wouldn't have studied piano at School of the Arts, for instance, wouldn't have gotten the fellowship at Lincoln Center that came out of that. And so, I mean, every little choice we make, of course, opens up a whole new world of paths, but also possibilities. And so, yeah, I'm aware that while those choices in the moment, seemed one or another, it's not as clear in retrospect because there's so many factors that go into everything. And now that I have Studio Showcase, I think I can look back on those and only worry about the positive things that came out of those choices rather than anything I might have left on the table, which was definitely and still is occasionally top of mind throughout my whole life.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of like the pain doesn't necessarily sink into the memory as much as the joys over time. You can kind of forget about the most difficult moments and be able to focus on the positive outcomes that came from making those decisions. But yeah, it sounds like
Yeah.
was a leap of faith at the time to a
hmm
certain extent to leave something that you knew was more of a sure thing with a steady paycheck to go for something
hmm
that your heart was really calling out for.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially more of a leap of faith then, because I was just going to get a degree in piano performance. I didn't have a vision of a career after that. Right. I was like, let me get as good as I can at my instrument, and maybe I'll teach, maybe I'll perform, maybe I'll, I don't know, come up with an idea that I haven't thought of yet. And that actually ended up happening. That last thing, which was kind of like, plan C. I think it is now like plan A,
Yeah, so
which
maybe
is
you could
funny.
talk through a little bit more specifically on what was that initial conception of Studio Showcase, what's it
Mhm.
evolved into in its current form.
Yeah. Studio Showcase, I think, started in 2013, at least in my brain. It's Genesis. And
Right.
I was my first year as a master's student at North Carolina School of the Arts. And I observed a master class, which in now in cultural vernacular, if you say the word masterclass, most people think of the online video learning platform that
Right.
raised like $150 million in seed funding immediately and is very widespread, where leaders in their fields give online video classes that you can subscribe to and watch. But in the performing arts world, a masterclass is known as more commonly as a different thing, where also a pro in their field, usually a famous performer, actor, painter, comes and gives a lesson or does some sort of teaching for a student or multiple students in front of an audience. In 2013, we had a famous pianist come to School of the Arts, and he did a masterclass with some of our students. And North Carolina School of the Arts is a public conservatory. It's the oldest public conservatory in the country. And as
Oh,
such, they have high school students, undergrad students, and graduate students across dance, drama, music, film, design and production, all those sorts of areas. And so my first year, I was 25 as a first year master's student at School of the Arts, but the best pianist at the school was 16. He must have been 16 or 17, and so
wow.
he was really, really excellent. Yeah, so he was a high school. I guess he must have been a high school junior at that time, maybe senior, and he was one of the students that played for this masterclass teacher, this professor, this pianist, and he played a short Rachmaninoff prelude in G sharp minor that is now, and given everything I'm about to say, is very near and dear to my heart and is like in my repertoire, and I play frequently, but I wasn't too familiar with it at that point. And he played it for the teacher, and he was excellent. And the teacher got up, and the first thing he said, it starts with like a really simple kind of 8-note melody in the left hand. There's like a fluttering thing in the right hand, and the teacher wasn't quite satisfied with his expression of this simple melody, and he wanted to bring out a little more creativity in the melody. And so he said this to the student, and he asked the student to play it again, given the feedback he had just gotten, and it was still not quite there, a little bit on the nose. And so again, the teacher said something, and the student played it again, and the teacher said, try this, and the student played it again. And he gave like probably 4 or 5 suggestions like this. And in the end, he ended up saying, you need to sound like you're improvising here. But that didn't quite get through to the student. And I had this moment watching this where I was waiting for the light bulb moment. I was waiting for the student to like make the change the teacher was asking for. And the audience, including me, we were on the edge of our seats, like waiting for this, like this great pianist teaching this great student, this very simple thing and there was just a small communication barrier there, or a lack of understanding of how to get this message across, especially in a public space.
Right.
And sitting in the audience, I could see the disappointment on the teacher's face. Not in the student as much as in himself, for not really being able to find the words or even demonstrate to him, kind of what he meant and what he wanted the student to find in himself and express. And I remember having 1 or 2 thoughts about like maybe what I could have said in that moment. And afterward, I talked to the teacher, and he said, yeah, like I just didn't know what to say. And that was 12 years ago. I didn't really think too much about that moment for another 5 years, but it was there. It was there in my head. And we had weekly studio classes with my studio teacher who would do these masterclass kind of formats. And so over the course of the next 2 years, I learned a lot about being an audience member, watching someone learn something, and also how to teach effectively in that kind of setting. And it was in a concrete, conservatory kind of environment. But those were the seeds. And then when I finished grad school, I got a fellowship at Lincoln Center in New York at Lincoln Center Education for the performing arts. And at Lincoln Center Ed, they focus on aesthetic education, which is a much more experiential, open way of allowing a student into a space to make art making personal for them and experiential in like a Deweyan sort of philosophy. And I think being a teaching artist there, going through that program, and then being a teaching artist at Lincoln Center, plus my love of this kind of format where you can watch someone learn their art with this seed of seeing a gap where magic almost happened but couldn't quite break through, germinated for about 5 years. And then in 2018, I started Studio Showcase. And at the time, I was working full-time, again, in corporate land, so I could pay rent in New York. And so I did it as kind of a passion project. I did it on the weekends. I started it at a library in Connecticut. And I would have students come from... I started with my teacher, who still has a flourishing studio. And, we know each other, and she trusts me, and she thinks I'm a great teacher. And she was like, absolutely, I'll send my students. So her students would come and play for the audience, and then I'd give a lesson in front of the audience. And, when I pitched this idea to the library, I started cold. I was like, I think this will work, but I've never done it before. I think I'd be great at it. I think the city would love to see it. And she was like, awesome, let's do it.
Nice.
And so I jumped right in, and I got my feet wet immediately in this idea and kind of refined it over the next 2 years. And we had monthly studio showcases until COVID. And then March 2020, the whole thing shut down. And live music obviously took a second to come back, but specifically classical music, I think live classical music really struggled because it's not good recorded. I don't know if you remember this, but like high school orchestras used to do that thing where you'd play your part and then they'd splice them together on Zoom. None of that ever worked. It didn't sound good. So classical music in particular and small venue classical music took a while to come back.
Right.
And that whole time I was working, and then I landed a gig playing a concerto, the soloist in an orchestra in March of 2023. And I was like, okay, this is my chance. I need to practice for this. Quit my job, did the concerto, and then focused full-time on Studio Showcase. So I've been doing that for about 2 years and just focusing on it.
Excellent. Maybe you could describe, and pardon my ignorance, but maybe some other folks in the audience are the same, as far as a conservatory environment. I know I've heard the word. I don't necessarily know what that means as far as like a different type of environment. Could you maybe describe that, and if that's what how your approach to Studio Showcase is similar or different in that regard?
I think everybody with an upbringing in classical music who goes on to have it be a central part of their life is always constantly balancing, what the great old masters want you to play like with yourself and kind of a progressive viewpoint on not just the music, but arts in the world. And specifically what I meant when I was talking about a conservatory setting in grad school is just I was very focused on classical technique that had been passed down from my teacher and his teacher and his teacher and my other teacher and her teacher and her teacher and her teacher, who was Beethoven, actually. And so all this stuff gets funneled down.
For real?
Yeah.
That's
the person
awesome.
I'm talking about, who I still play with all the time. Yeah, I'm a student of a student of a student of a student of Beethoven. So everyone who comes to Studio Showcase through her, actually, I guess effectively now is in that lineage as well. But
that's amazing.
It's not that hard to get 6 degrees from somebody like Beethoven, And I think a conservatory mindset or setting conserves practices that have been passed down in that tradition. And I think almost everybody in music, at least classical music, will tell you that those things are important. But it's very, very easy to treat it in a way that makes it inaccessible for anyone that watches or sees or hears that kind of art form. And, in that way, classical music is often its own worst enemy, in that, where there's this reputation of classical music that it's stuck up, or that there's one way to do it. There's a hierarchy. These are the best pianists. These are the second tier pianists. And then I'm like here, and like, is it worth listening to that student? Right. So I think one thing I was proud of at North Carolina School of the Arts is our studio didn't have as much of a competitive conservatory mindset as some of them maybe do. I really felt helped by my peers, and I felt a camaraderie there, and our studio teacher definitely fostered that. And I wasn't trying to outshine any of them, and they weren't trying to be better than any of the rest of us, which I think is the common trope at a lot of conservatories. And definitely I saw in other studios around campus, and not even in just music, right? But
Yeah.
I mean, working together is so important to me. And Studio Showcase, which I guess I haven't really even said what it is, but maybe you could infer based on what we're talking about. But I don't use the word masterclass because that video learning platform that's gained so much attention, and secondly, because I don't really believe in the master student model. It's not a word I want to use for a number of reasons, master, and so I don't do it. It's called Studio Showcase because a teacher sends their students from their studio to play for the audience. So the students in Studio Showcase get an opportunity, a low-stakes performing opportunity to play in front of an audience and then get a lesson from a top teaching artist. And if it's a pianist, it's me, usually. The idea for Studio Showcase is that eventually we will be big enough to do all instruments. We'll have tons of teachers on the roster, and I can just make sure that every one of those teachers, rather than doing every Studio Showcase myself, I can focus on making sure every one of those facilitators, those teaching artists that works for Studio Showcase is able to make those connections that were missing, for instance, in that one first masterclass I ever saw.
Right.
So Studio Showcase uses this format to allow the student to have a novel experience, but also to bring the audience into this kind of magic making. And I've the reason that this is now my sole focus is I haven't seen classical music and really any art have quite the effect it can have on an audience when they watch a student learn something in real time. When that magic happens in front of your eyes, it's something special. It's better than just watching a performance, right? Because you see how the sausage is made. It's a look under the hood, all the other American idioms. And
Right.
and I've seen, and I've been told by everybody who watches it that it's a unique experience, and I want as many students and as many audience members to have that experience of watching someone grow in their art. So that's what Studio Showcase does. Not that you asked me.
Yeah, yeah, and I imagine it would make it more approachable, kind of comprehensible, like you're saying, the history and tradition and kind of culture and myth really around classical music is
Myth is a good word, yeah.
yeah, it's almost like exclusive or maybe even elitist to a certain extent. I was kind of thinking in prep for this discussion, like, oh, do you find yourself a benefactor, like a banking family, and then they just support your lifestyle and you have to compose things to them for their birthday every year, like that kind of stuff?
Look,
like,
JT, I wish.
Yeah. It's like, does that really exist anymore? But yeah, I would imagine that in that kind of setting where you're watching somebody learn in real time almost makes them more human and more relatable and gives it a little bit more of approachability to even as a consumer. Like, okay, I can now kind of see what are the decisions they're making, what things to kind of look out for as far as maybe creativity versus sticking with the traditional line or things like that before. Now, are the audience members, are they students of the same instrument as well typically, or is it kind of open to anybody?
No, I mean, it's open to anybody, but in fact, I prefer them not to be necessarily musical. I mean, these kinds of opportunities for top student musicians with audiences who know exactly what's happening are available. They're all over the place, like I saw in grad school. What isn't there, and what I think can benefit society and concertgoers more, is not the best student ever in the history of 14-year-olds playing for an audience that knows exactly what they're talking about, but playing for an audience who has a gap in knowledge about what art making, specifically in our field, is. And so being able to help an audience member and multiple audience members fill that gap through an engaging event where you're also seeing an awesome performance is not just more inspiring because you get to see a student who wouldn't otherwise have this opportunity really do what they love, but also is just exponentially more beneficial because you're not helping the pianists in the audience at my grad school masterclass, for instance, as much as you're helping somebody who doesn't know anything about this. And I do believe that everybody has something that they want to learn in a format like this, and they just might not know it yet. And so that's part of what Studio Showcase does.
Now, in your teaching approach, you mentioned having the lineage and the traditions carried down from one teacher to the next. How much do you try to balance that with your own creative elements and how you direct your students?
Yeah, I guess there are two things I'll say to that. The first is when I teach, let's use me as the teaching artist as an example. When I teach a Studio Showcase, almost always it's the first time I'm meeting the student, right? They're not mine. They are a guest, and I am a visiting teaching artist. And this student has a full-time instrumental teacher. And so things like technique, what Beethoven would have said about this passage, and stuff like that can come up occasionally. But mostly those kinds of things that we're talking about, I will leave that to the student's teacher. It is purely an additive experience. And when I find teachers that love sending students to Studio Showcase, in part, it's because it's purely that additive experience. I'm not stepping on their toes. I'm not trying to be a better teacher. I'm certainly not trying to like steal any students from anybody. And I want to foster the student's relationship with their current teacher and just give outside perspectives on something that might be able to bring the student more close to their music personally. And the other part of that, I think, my teaching philosophy, not only do I have it's a privilege really of not having to address like finer technical details with the student and being able to leave that to their teacher, and it allows me to bring in my own teaching philosophy, which is heavily involved with aesthetic education that I learned at Lincoln Center and is extremely progressive in that kind of way. And I want to be authentic. I want to be outside of the box, and I want to invite the student into that space. At Lincoln Center Education, they preach an aesthetic education philosophy, which really, to sum up, means if we can bring the student into the process of art making and give them an experiential learning about their art, then they can find ways to connect it to themselves. And that's how we find students make new connections and learn and grow in ways that, they don't equate to reading a passage out of a textbook or other kind of induction-based pedagogies. And so part of Studio Showcase is if the goal is to bring a student into a learning experience like that, couldn't we also bring a whole bunch of other people at the same time into that experience? So the student partakes in it, but the audience also does. And they don't have to be a pianist. And that's a very special moment, right? To feel like you're learning something about the piano, never having played one.
Right. Yeah, it feels like it would open up people's perspectives, like even if they never did then try to pick up piano or learn it afterward, just to have like these more like metaphorical connections to other problems or problem-solving type approaches they have in different areas of their life. Have you noticed that yourself with lessons that you've learned in your music, and just as it applies, maybe even relationships, family, friends, other life decision-making factors? How has that music philosophy translated into your everyday life?
Yeah, that's funny. My hobby on the side is ultimate frisbee, and I've started a men's ultimate frisbee team in New York, and I've captained a number of teams. And near the beginning of the Studio Showcase process, a couple of my friends from one of the teams I captained came to one of the shows. And afterward, my friend Nick, who had never seen me teach before, or maybe even play, he was like, you do that exactly like you coach frisbee. So I felt like I had seen you do that a million times. And I had never thought about that before, but of course, if your philosophy is to invite people into a learning space rather than tell them things about it, that it's going to bleed into every aspect of your life. And the most meaningful feedback I get after Studio Showcases is exactly what you're talking about, is people who aren't musicians and haven't heard any of this telling me they learned something afterward just by watching. So yeah, I do think it's impossible to really believe and live into a teaching philosophy and then not, or any sort of philosophy, and then not have it permeate every facet of your life. I have struggled with the question in my head, throughout my life. Have you heard the old adage that how you do one thing is how you do everything?
Yes.
I can't quite decide whether it's true or not. And, I think balancing the two answers to that question has been a really interesting, philosophical experiment for me over the course of the last few years. And I find those core philosophical questions quite interesting. The other one being, is ignorance bliss? I don't know. We could probably do another podcast about that, but I do think when you live into a teaching philosophy like I have with Studio Showcase, it does permeate everything.
Yeah. We won't spend too much time on the how you do everything, because I first heard that, I believe it was a yoga teacher had said that during a class, and my initial knee-jerk reaction was almost fear, because I knew there were a lot of things in my life that I did not do well.
Right.
I was like, oh wait, does that mean everything in my life I'm not doing well? No, I do some things well.
Yeah.
But I think now my framing on how I take that message is that it can be the case. It can be the case that if you put intention and attention and focus and really put your best foot forward on all of the small things, then that will tend to have spillover effects into other and maybe all other aspects of your life, so that giving due time and focus to small things will then lead to focus on big things, and it'll be kind of like a virtuous cycle rather than kind of being like you have to do everything perfectly in all
Right.
aspects of your life in order to be perfect in any aspect.
Yeah, and bringing awakeness like to education is kind of a pillar of the philosophy I've been talking about. And Maxine Green, who founded Lincoln Center Institute, which became Lincoln Center Education, was an educational scholar and a Dewey scholar, and kind of popularized the term aesthetic education. And sometimes when people ask what that is, the best way to describe it is to tell what her antonym for aesthetic was, which of course is anesthetic, as in, anesthesia. And so in that way, aesthetic education is fostering an awakeness, and kind of an intentionality, like you're saying, like if we take the little things and intentionally understand that we can transfer them to everything we do, then yeah, it can be the case.
Yeah, I love that. I've actually never heard that before. I mean, obviously it makes sense when you look at the words themselves, but hadn't made that link mentally. Anesthetic as a numbing agent, as a way to turn off your sensory experience. So the opposite of that would be to turn on and
exactly.
Explore that sensory experience.
English is never an accident, and there's so much learning to do there. And I'm not surprised, but I'm always pleasantly able to discuss etymology and things like Studio Showcase, and it comes up so frequently.
Very cool. Yeah. A lot of extracurricular benefits to the live experience and teaching and learning things that you never thought would come
art as
up.
a holistic experience rather than like a siloed medium is super, super important.
Yeah. Maybe we could kind of touch on your personal approach to it. How much, maybe you can talk about some of your influences, some of your favorite composers, artists, pianists, and then what your goals are for your own creations.
Yeah. I mean, my educators and my friends and my family and the personal, I think, connections I've made throughout my life and my artistic career are much more influential to me than historical composers or, famous pianists, who certainly influence the world and what I do and what my students play when they come to me. But, I think I can't stress enough how inspiring it is to watch something personal. You have to, like we were saying, you have to also live into that. And so for me, I draw inspiration from my students, my teachers, my friends, my family. And, there are a number of ways that you can engage with classical music in the world that aren't live or aren't personal. Namely YouTube. I mean, YouTube has been such a boon for classical musicians who it's a perfect combination of like an archive of a million videos, not necessarily sorted by number of views, right? So some of the most important classical music content has like 20 views on YouTube.
Right.
But it's a nice balance of that and it being free, because classical musicians don't often have a lot of money. So so many people that I teach and so many of my students, do most of their kind of engaging with classical music through YouTube or like platforms. And so, yeah, it's possible to find inspiration there. And specifically with what I do with Studio Showcase, there are piano masterclasses available to watch online. I don't particularly think there are very many, and there certainly aren't very many that I think appeal to a broad array of people that we're trying to appeal to and like bring this kind of magical medium to. So yeah, it's out there and you can engage. But I think when we're talking about influences, it's really important to understand that your influences are valid, whoever they are, and they have to be personal, and that's what's going to move you the most.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And where are your studios for Studio Showcase? Are you out of one particular kind of home base, or do you kind of pop up in different spots? Like, where can people find this?
Yeah, that's kind of, well, we have a website, studioshowcase.org, but that's kind of the point, is that we don't have a brick and mortar place. We can do a Studio Showcase anywhere. All we need is 50 seats and a piano. right? And might not even need that if it's a different instrument. So we host them in different locations throughout. I live in New York City, so we're kind of based in New York here, but I've also hosted studio showcase in Indiana and North Carolina, and really wherever I have a connection to a teacher that's interested in the studio showcase program. So as we continue to grow, because there's no single place that this has to operate out of, we can expand anywhere, and that's the idea.
Very cool. Yeah. So if anyone's interested, I guess teachers themselves or students that are looking for this, they can kind of go onto your site, express interest, and reach out to you that way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the two main connections that we try to make with Studio Showcase is with a studio. And if you're a music teacher out there and you want to give your students an experience like this to perform in front of an audience, have a lesson with a visiting teaching artist completely for free. By the way, everything's completely for free. That's the bedrock of this. The student doesn't pay. In fact, we have transportation stipends, so it doesn't even cost them anything to get to the venue. So if you're a studio teacher and you want to associate your studio with this program, again, completely free of cost to you with Studio Showcase, that's one big entry point. And the other one is a venue. If you're a venue that wants to host this kind of event, if you're a music school or a community center or a public library, another space like that has a community room or an auditorium of sorts, and you're looking to expand your programming to something that's unique and features local, diverse students, this is kind of the perfect avenue for that. So yeah, those would be the two entry points, I think.
That's awesome. So if it's free for the students, what's your sustainability on how to keep things going? Is there donation based tickets for the audience?
Yeah, like we're running pretty much entirely on donations and revenue from private events. So Studio Showcase also functions really well as a workshop for businesses or other types of people who want to engage with their employees and show them what meaningful instruction or coaching or teaching looks like. So that's the kind of revenue generating arm of Studio Showcase. And also we go to schools. So it's during the week, we'll do Studio Showcase series at a school auditorium. And then in that case, the school or the music teachers at the school can select whoever they think. We usually encourage a need-based kind of criteria, but whoever they think wants to participate or will get the most out of participating in the Studio Showcase. Then, we have a number of generous contributors that see this product, believe in it, and know that we're not at the stage yet where we're entirely self-sustainable on revenue. So yeah, donations are a huge part of how we subsist. And probably this will be a nonprofit within the next 12 months, I would say. I mean, the for-profit versus nonprofit model is something we can talk about, and I've loved being transparent about and talking about with different administrators from both sides of that. But, the goal is to do Studio Showcase as much as I can in front of as many people as I can for as many students as I can. And so if a nonprofit will help us get more donations and apply for more grants, we're going to do that. And if we can exist as a for-profit where we just put the money back into A, funding host venues, right? And B, keeping the lights on with event director, me, other teaching artists, that's the idea.
Right. Yeah. No, awesome approach. And I wish you the best in building that up. It sounds like it could be very beneficial. I know myself with a corporate type of team building activity, something like that, like you're mentioning, just look, the leader of a corporate team could probably learn a lot from a leader and a teacher of someone in the arts. I think a lot of those transferable skills and different approaches could be super beneficial to a lot of different aspects of that.
That's not something I planned or expected. Right. I just kind of started telling people about this idea, and I had a few people say, "Why don't you do this for my management team?" Or I'm leading a consulting workshop that sounds like a great fit. And so I took the first gig 2 years ago doing that, and it worked. It worked pretty well. It worked great. Yeah.
Excellent. I'll drop the links to studioshowcase.org in the description there. Any other places where folks can reach out or come see you next?
We have an Instagram, and I need to actually hire a social media manager because I'm 37 and not so good at Instagram, but we that does exist. Our next showcase is open to the public. Actually, it's on September 28th, and it's at the library in Darien, Connecticut, where I went to high school, and it's an awesome space. It's like 150 seats, beautiful community room, baby grand piano, and I think at least one of the students will be a student of my former teacher, who is the student of a student of Beethoven. Actually, it might just be three. I don't know. It's a pretty close connection.
Yeah, I was
And
gonna say, you didn't live all that long ago. And
yeah,
he's
right,
lived it
right.
all.
I assume you've seen that thing where like there's only been 2 lifetimes between George Washington and now, or something, whatever that is.
Right, if
And
someone lives old enough, right?
right,
Yeah.
right, right. So yeah, it's not that far down the lineage. But again, he's long gone, and I think any student's influences are should be more timely and personal than that. But yeah, so
Right.
that's September 28th, Sunday, 3 p.m. at the Darien Library.
Very cool. Yeah, well, thank you for coming on the show and sharing your perspective here. I wanted to give you any last comments you wanted to leave with the audience, maybe any inspiration or advice for folks like yourself who are trying to pursue their passion out there.
Yeah, well, I think you're modeling that, first of all, JT. I appreciate
Thank you.
you doing this with a wide array of guests and really letting the guests kind of focus on their area and what they're passionate about. First of all, I think you're a model for that. So congrats on this.
Thank you.
This has
I
been
appreciate that.
really awesome to watch grow. Yeah, but yeah, I think the philosophy that I'd preach is, especially when we all kind of are teachers, in our everyday lives, and the difference between maybe a teacher who does it professionally and just a person who lives and interacts with the world is that most of our one-off teaching experiences don't have the benefit of establishing a rapport with a student or knowing anything about that student's background, or doing any sort of prep work or prior research. And part of what I do at Studio Showcase part of what we do is we try to have those organic moments and model those organic moments and show that you can have an effect on someone in an educational way, in an educational space, in your everyday life, not being a professional teacher, not having any prior relationship with that person. And like those moments of growth can happen anywhere. And, pretty much everybody is capable of that. You center the student and allow a space for them to be authentic and them to grow. And that's what we do at Studio Showcase. And I think everybody probably could bring a little more aesthetic awareness to that kind of fact.
Yeah. Yeah. You kind of create the space and the time to allow those kind of magical moments, those moments of interaction and connection
Right.
to thrive and flourish there.
Exactly. And that can happen in any arena.
Excellent. Well, yeah, thank you again so much for coming on the show, Zach. It was really a pleasure to speak to you, and best of luck with continuing to grow and expand and explore with the Studio Showcase model.
Thanks, JT. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody, for listening. See you next time.